Well, I remember conducting a funeral service for one of my church members back in the very first district where I was a pastor. And this funeral service happened in the hometown of this lady, this person who had passed away. In fact, it was a small town. It was the town, actually, where Henry Fire Robin grew up. So it wasn't where he was born, but it was where he grew up, a little town. Now, here, from a Toronto perspective, you think of a little town as like 50,000 people. This was a little town. This was like 1,000 people or less. I would be surprised if there was 1,000 people there. Where our church was in the next town. It was a big town. We had like 2,500 people there. But this was where this person had lived for so many years of her life. And when I went to conduct this funeral, I was surprised to find that it was happening in such a large, spacious, and beautiful church. What was even more surprising was that this same small town had two other large churches, big, beautiful churches very close by, and they were of the same denomination. And two of them, at least, as I can recall, because it was a long time ago, were right on the same intersection. They were across the street from each other in the same corner. And the third one, I can't remember if it was in the same intersection or if it was maybe a block down, but you could stand there and you could see all three churches at once. And I thought, any one of these churches probably could have provided comfortable seating for just about everybody who lived in the town. I thought, this is interesting, these three great big churches of the same denomination in this little tiny town. Now, having such churches, three of them would not maybe of itself be necessarily bad if they were there because they were each focused on reaching out to a different segment of society or something like that. But I asked, I said, wow, this is a big, our church in the town over that was bigger, it was a modest, kind of appropriately sized church for the town. But I said, wow, this is a big church. This is a nice church. What's the deal? And as it was explained to me, the situation resulting in these three separate churches of the same denomination was not so positive. What had happened is what happens so often in denominations and people. What had happened in this town was that at first there had been one church of this particular denomination, but then somewhere along the line some kind of controversy had arisen. And that controversy heated up, and eventually there was a split. So now there was two churches. And then in a bit of time, there was another controversy, a heated controversy, and there was another split, and now there were three churches. Three big churches, same denomination, one small town. And no one in the group was going to be outdone by the others. So when one church built a nice, big, beautiful church, folks across the street said, "What?" And they built a nicer, bigger, beautiful church. And the third group said, "Oh yeah?" And they built a nicer, bigger, beautiful church. So one small town, three big, beautiful churches. What's the famous saying? United we stand, divided we fall. Today I would like us to take a look at a warning from the Apostle Paul that he gave about the issue of division. It's found in Romans. If you've got a Bible you can access. Romans, at the end of Romans chapter 16, the last chapter. And I'd like us to look at verses 17 and 18. New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, and then comes Romans. Romans chapter 16, verses 17 and 18. Have an interesting warning contained in the Scriptures. Romans 16, verse 17, Paul writes, "Now I urge you, brethren, note those who cause divisions and offenses, contrary to the doctrine which you learned, and avoid them. For those who are such do not serve our Lord Jesus Christ, but their own belly, and by smooth words and flattering speech deceive the hearts of the simple." So this warning, if you're reading along in Romans, it just sort of pops up unexpectedly here near the end of Paul's letter to the believers in Rome. Maybe he was going to close off the letter and this warning came to mind. All through Romans 16, Paul has been sending greetings to various Christians that he knew lived there in Rome. But then suddenly it's kind of like as those greetings are happening, it just abruptly stops, and we have this warning in verse 17. And then Paul continues on expounding on that through the end of verse 20. And then in verse 21, he carries on with some more greetings. Maybe he thought of some more people he needed to mention, I don't know. And so it's kind of catches you by surprise, this warning, as you're reading through. And yet, if we consider the setting and the context of what Paul has been saying in this letter, perhaps the warning isn't so out of place. Because Paul had been speaking of the need for love, the need for unity, the need for tolerance and acceptance among fellow believers in the church. And here in chapter 16, his greetings have been very positive, very affirming. It's an upbeat tone. The way he refers to those he is sending greetings to reveals his own Christian affection for them. The context of unity is made clear in verse 16, where Paul calls for the believers in Rome to greet one another, and then he widens the Christian circle of unity by saying, all the churches of Christ greet you. So it's a very unified tone. And even the tone of the warning itself in verse 17 begins with a note of unity. He begins by calling them brothers. Perhaps as he thought fondly of the Christians that he knew in Rome, and then as he thought of the churches that he was acquainted with in other areas, maybe this warning, just as he was about to close his letter, just naturally came to mind. Paul seems to have confidence in the Christians there in Rome. He says in verse 19, "For your obedience has been known to all, therefore I am glad on your behalf." But even so, Paul had been around. Paul had experience with many churches. He knew of the dangers. He knew of the destruction and division the devil desires to bring to a group of believers. And so, not wanting to see these dear believers that he was writing to harmed, Paul imploringly shares this last warning with them before closing out his letter. So let's look at it a little closer now. Let's think about this a bit today. This warning in Romans 16, verse 17. Let me read it again. Paul says, "Now I urge you, brethren, note those who cause divisions and offenses contrary to the doctrine which you learned, and avoid them." Paul has a warning here. He says, watch out. Watch out. He's telling the Roman Christians that they need to be awake, they need to be on guard. He is calling them to action here, and really it's a mental action. In the King James it says to mark those. New King James says note those. That's really what it means. It means to note, to pay attention to be on the watch out for, to keep the eye on. There are two things that Paul tells the Roman Christians to do in this verse, two actions. This is the first one, and it is the prerequisite to the second one. So even if those who would cause division and offenses are not bothering the church much right now, Paul warns the Roman Christians to take the initiative, to be alert, to pay attention to what is going on. He's saying, keep your eyes open, be mentally prepared. Perhaps these words from a Bible commentator named Henry aptly sum up the idea behind this warning. I like these words. Commenting on Romans 16:17, I think this is a cool little saying. He said, "A danger discovered is half prevented." Does that make sense? A danger discovered is half prevented. Paul is saying, be on guard and you can be ready. But now, what are they to watch out for? What does it say? What are they to watch out for? Divisions and offenses in the church? Is that it? Yes and no. Well, aren't you glad you didn't answer? More precisely, he says they are to watch out for people. Watch out for people, specifically those people who cause divisions and offenses. Allow me to quote from Henry again. I like how he puts it. He said, "Do not look only at the divisions and offenses, but run up those streams to the fountain and mark those that cause them." You know, it's easy to get caught up in the latest controversy, right? I mean, we just this month had a general conference session of our church. Was there any controversy going into that? just a bit of discussion, right? And truthfully, some of that discussion was a bit disturbing to me, because some of it was starting to sound pretty strong rhetoric, pretty strong, this doesn't go the way it's supposed to be, that's it, we're leaving, we're good, time to pull out of the church. Pretty divisive, right? It's easy to get caught up in that stuff, isn't it? And if you didn't, God bless you. But Paul is telling the Roman Christians, he says, don't just get caught up in that. Stop and consider the source. Where is the controversy coming from? Paul warns of two things that those who should be watched will cause among believers. And the first one is divisions. You know, to divide and conquer has been Satan's method right from the beginning. It has been his modus operandi, or however you say that. All the way back to heaven. In heaven, he succeeded in dividing the angels into two camps. Isn't that amazing? Perfect beings living in a perfect setting, showered under the love of a perfect God. And somehow he was like, well, what about this God? I don't know. Wonder about him sometimes. Seems he's a little in control, isn't he? I mean, isn't that amazing that he could work division in such a setting? Revelation 12:7 tells us that war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought with the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought in heaven. And then the work of division came down here to earth. In the Garden of Eden, Satan brought division between Adam and Eve, resulting in both of them sinning. And then he worked division between the first two kids on earth, Cain and Abel. Siblings have been fighting ever since. Me and my sister did, and on through history. We need to recognize division for the threat that it is. Once we get involved in dissensions, in quarreling and disagreements, what happens is we no longer make any progress together. Instead of looking and moving forward together to a common goal, we end up actually stopping and looking instead at each other. And when we do that, then our unity is at risk. If instead of moving ahead toward our goal, we remain in a state of discord, then the division deepens and we will sooner or later separate and head off in different directions, weaker apart than we could have been together. And if we go in different directions, then that means we can't both still be heading towards the same goal, can it? Unless we're taking a really detour route. And sometimes, probably too often, what happens is neither group is anymore really heading towards the destination. You see, it seems to me that division doesn't just happen. I don't think division is coincidence. I believe it is instigated, be it intentional and consciously instigated or not. That's why Paul, I think, warned not just to be on guard for division, but watch out for those who cause the divisions. Now, Jesus realized that division would be a threat to his followers. And thus we have his beautiful prayer recorded in John 17 where he prayed for his people, his followers, that they would have unity. For his people he prayed that they all may be one, as you, Father, he said, are in me and I in you, and that they also may be one in us. Prayed for that unity. I like how Paul put it. If you've still got Romans 16 there, go to the next chapter, which happens to be 1 Corinthians chapter 1. And look at this plea for unity. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 10. Paul says, "Now I plead with you, brethren, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that you all speak the same thing, and that there be no divisions among you, but that you be perfectly joined together in the same mind and in the same judgment." Paul, too, recognized the danger of division. He said, watch out for those who cause division. And then the second thing Paul warns the Roman Christians to watch out for people causing is offenses, or as the New American Standard Bible puts it, hindrances. I think the idea is actually expressed most clearly in the phrasing of the New International Version where it says, "I urge you, brothers, to watch out for those who cause divisions and put obstacles in your way." If you remember back in chapter 14, Paul has already made it clear that believers are not to put a stumbling block in the way of fellow believers. Christians, we're not supposed to do anything that would damage or discourage another Christian's faith. So now here he warns against those who would do just that. Beware of those who go around spreading confusion and creating doubts in people's minds. That ever happen in the church? It's always interesting to hear your response. I don't know if that's I just woke up, or I agree, or what. Yeah, you got to hear that sometime. Yeah, has it ever happened, Oh, I don't know, man, the church is getting bad. Church is going down all the wrong roads. I don't know. I think there's a lot of problems. Paul is saying, watch out for those spreading confusion and creating doubts. Watch out for those who have a tendency to get people sidetracked away from the main core of the gospel. away from the commission that God has given us. Watch out for those who are always turning small, minor issues into big, important issues. Have you heard about some big, important issues that don't seem so big and important, but somehow they are because everybody's talking about them? Paul has written at length to the Romans about righteousness by faith in this letter. And now he tells them to keep an eye on those whose actions put this faith in jeopardy. If it is by faith that we accept and obtain righteousness and the gift of eternal life, then he's saying we need to be consciously aware of those who are undermining and weakening the faith of Christian believers, who are doing whatever it is that gets believers away from a solid relationship with Christ in that faith relationship, off on all kinds of matters, which somehow take away from what matters most. So having already stressed in this letter to the Roman Christians the importance of Christian unity and Christian faith, Paul closes with a warning against those who would threaten to destroy that unity through division, against those who would threaten to destroy that faith through hindrances and obstacles constantly put in people's way. But now the next part of Romans 16:17 is very important. The part that says, contrary to the doctrine which you learned. See, here is the guideline. Here is a solid reference point for determining who should be taken note of. He says, by the doctrine which you learned. Paul is referring to the teachings of the gospel, the fundamental principles and truths of Christianity. Having been instructed in this doctrine, the Roman Christians would have a basis for evaluating the effect of various people on the group of believers. You know, when someone's coming in and doing stuff and saying stuff, how do we know if that's good or bad? We need to say, how does it line up? How does it reinforce the basic truths and principles of Christianity? In other words, people needed to ask some questions. Did a person's influence among those in the church tend to strengthen unity in the teachings and principles of the gospel, or did it tend to lead people off in a different direction? Did a person tend to create or be often involved in conflict and controversy that caused people to lose track of their focus, to lose their grasp on the central truths of Christianity? Did a person's influence tend to build up and encourage the faith of his or her fellow Christians, or was it more likely to more often cause strife to that faith by prompting doubt in the clear and simple gospel teachings that they had received? If the Roman Christians believed that the teachings of Christianity were from God, then Paul was saying to them it would be wise to be on guard against those who would attempt to undermine or obscure those beliefs. That stuff ever happen? Don't want to answer this time. You know, I don't have time, but I'm going to take time anyways. You know, it does happen, right? I think of a family who are members of one of my churches, one place, sometime, somewhere, in some lifetime. And very nice Christian people. You meet these people. I'm saying these people. It's really one person in the family, but I'm just trying to be a little more vague. You meet these people, very nice, pleasant people. But boy, my goodness, I learned that there was a constant undertone of question, always a concern, lots of concern. Church is always going in the wrong direction. Very rarely happy that anything good has happened, always concerned. Always expressing those concerns even to inactive members who haven't been to church for like a decade, going around, I don't know, what do you think about the church? It's a little bit off track. Always attention. Very nice people. Came to church here today, you met them, you'd say, wow, what nice, lovely Adventist Christian people. Transfer their membership here, nominating committee would vote them into all kinds of offices. Good, solid, ready to work people. But man, there's always that thing underneath. And after quite a few decades, people transferred to another church, which was also a church I pastored. I thought, oh, this is interesting. This was a fairly new church, fairly cohesive church, small church, group of people that really were focused on working together to reach the community for Christ. And I watched an interesting thing. Within less than half a year, I sat at a board meeting with that church, and I watched these people who had formed this church together and worked so hard in the community, I watched them just tear each other apart. I mean, they went at it for like 45 minutes. I didn't even say a word. They just, husbands and wives, best friends, I mean, yelling at each other, just went ballistic. I was in shock. And when they were done yelling and screaming at each other, there were a lot of tears. They actually got up spontaneously and hugged each other and said, "What has happened to us? What has happened to us?" They apologized to me. It was okay. I was just sitting there watching in horror. You know what they were fighting about? And I'm not talking about the issue, but instead of spending time thinking like they usually did about how can we share Christ with the community, they were fighting about what happens if someone comes into the church during the week, maybe like a volunteer to clean the church or something. What if they bring a cup of coffee into the church? What if they've been at Tim Hortons and they bring a cup of coffee? I mean, they ripped each other apart about that hypothetical cup of coffee. And you had to have a sense of sitting there and saying, what's going on? What happened to how can we reach the community for Christ to killing each other verbally? And it was the influence of that family. Came in and nicely, very piously, godly, just started raising concerns by person to person. Tore that church apart. It was powerful. Circumstances changed and the family moved to another place far away, quite far away. And I knew the pastor in the church where they moved. The pastor called me up and he was like, "Wow, Darren, man, how come you didn't tell me you were sending me such wonderful church members? And these people are so active, so committed to Christ, so willing to get involved. It's just wonderful." And I didn't really say much. I didn't know what to say. And I met that pastor at camp meeting a few months later. And he's like, "Oh, Darren, now I understand why you didn't say anything." That pastor has a passion like I've never seen any other pastor have to make ties with the community, to have the Adventist church work with fellow Christian churches and really share Christ in the community. It was a community that he was born in, and before he retired, he was pastoring that small community, pastoring the church in that small community, and he had worked for decades to build solid ties so that the Adventist church was respected in that community and worked well with the other churches. Guy had spent his life building up those ties. And he's like, "I can't believe it." He said, it's less than half a year, and our church is like ripped apart, divided. Everybody's fighting. The community hates us. Everybody's talking about us in the community, and they're against us. And all that work that had been done for decades was just like wiped out in a few months. Some of the nicest Christian people you'll meet, but oh my goodness, what an influence. Okay, I've spent way too long on that. But does it happen? It happens. It happens. And then we come to the last part of verse 17 where Paul again tells his readers to take the initiative and act. First, remember, he told them to be on watch for and take note of those individuals who cause divisions and offenses contrary to what they had been taught. Now, having done that, Paul makes clear what their reaction to such a person should be. What is their reaction, he says? They are to avoid that person. Now, of course, those two active steps that Paul suggests naturally go together. How could you avoid those causing divisions and hindrances if you had not first taken note of who they are, right? If I say, go avoid somebody, can you do that? I guess so, but that's a pretty indirect command, right? You obviously have to know who you're avoiding if you're going to avoid them. Now, at first, that sounds like a pretty strong action to take, right? Is that a nice Christian thing to do, avoid them? Notice also what Paul doesn't say to do. He doesn't say to attack them. He doesn't say to hate them. He doesn't say to seek revenge on them. He doesn't say to stop loving them. He simply says to avoid them. And that means, I think, to take a solid active stand against their harmful practices. In other words, he's warning the Christians in Rome to be alert so that they won't get sucked into something that could pull them away from or hinder their growth in the truth of the gospel. I think it means to turn your back on those causing division and offense, to display your disapproval for such actions. It kind of reminds me of years ago. I don't know if it's still true, but years ago there was this slogan when you were talking to kids, and they were trying to encourage kids to not take drugs. Someone comes up and offers you drugs, and they had a slogan that said, "Just say no." Right? Just say no. And I think that's what Paul is saying here spiritually. Just say no. Someone wants to always dig up all of the problems and get you discouraged. Sometimes we need to just say no. No, you know what? I'm actually busy trying to follow Christ and work on his commission. So I don't have time for endless controversies and conspiracies and theories and doubts and disputations. I actually want to serve Christ and live a life for him. Just say no. It would seem that this avoidance is more than just a physical avoidance. Probably to be able to physically avoid a person causing these troubles would be best, but not likely always possible. Because from time to time, if not most of the time, since we live pre-Christ's second coming, there are bound to be people among the believers who will fit into the category of people that Paul is warning about here. And surely Paul wasn't encouraging the Christians, well, I'm going to avoid them, so I'm not going to go to church anymore. That way I'll never see them. Well, I don't think that was the plan, because that doesn't work so well. Paul wasn't saying stop meeting together so you could avoid possibly coming into contact with someone whose influence might be negative. It's not so much a physical thing. It's not like, you park out at the far corner of the Branson Hospital parking lot with your binoculars and you watch for when they're coming to church and you watch where they park. And if they park on the east side of the church, then you park on the west side of the church. You can come in a different door because there's lots of doors in this building. And you're in here in church and then, maybe you need to use the restroom, but maybe they're in there. So you got to watch for a while till it's an appropriately long time and wait till you see them out so you can slip in, And make sure you sit at the front of the church because you can get out these doors really quick, hardly have to say hello to anybody. Maybe one elder will catch you on the way out, and you don't meet them in the foyer. And if you're a greeter, you got to give up your greeting job because you might have to shake their hand in the foyer. See, that avoiding like that is almost impossible, right, if we're going to be a part of the church? Seems like it's more of a mental thing. It's a decision that you make mentally. It's choosing to keep moving forward in the truth that we have been taught rather than getting sidetracked in the divisions and offenses that some might create. Not getting wrapped up in the divisive conflicts and arguments or doubts and petty issues that are stirred up constantly. It's about watching and taking note. Comes down to a matter of paying attention to the warning, watching and avoiding. This is a challenge that always has been a problem as long as sin has been around. Like we said, it started in heaven. Lucifer stirred up divisive controversy, raised doubts in the minds of the angels about the truth and principles that God had taught them. And it's carried on. Look at the Old Testament. Look at God's people, right? God brings them, what a process, brings them to the promised land. And what happens in short order? Bam, divided kingdom. You got Israel and Judah. God's people divided. Jesus warned in Matthew 7:15, he said, "Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravenous wolves." The first few chapters of Romans reveals that the Christians there of Jewish and Gentile background, they needed to have a little better unity. They weren't always getting along so well. And he said, you guys are all Christians, and you need to sort some of this stuff out. The fact that Paul includes this warning indicates the danger of division and hindrance contrary to the true Christian doctrine, that it was very real. You know what? You look at the history of the Christian church, and there's some amazing, wonderful things that happen in the history of Christianity, and there's some sad things, tragic things. Look at the early days of the Christian church, the early centuries. Once the persecution stopped and there wasn't someone at your back trying to kill you all the time, then the church kind of relaxed. And you know what they started doing? Started splitting hairs on the finest of theological debates. Huge, heady arguments about fine details of theology. They would argue about it, and they would meet for councils for years sometimes. And when they didn't agree, there would be a schism. Oh, that's a ridiculous decision. We're going to go start our own branch of the Christian church. And those branches are still there today. Division. It's happened. And it happens up to today. And of course, like most denominations, the history of our denomination includes division as well. Individuals, groups who have become involved in doctrinal division or personal conflicts eventually break away from the church at large, and it takes a toll on God's people. One of the early leaders of our church, Ellen White, wrote this counsel for the church. This is Testimonies 5, page 236. She wrote, "Union is strength, division is weakness. When those who believe present truth are united, they exert a telling influence. Satan well understands this. Never was he more determined than now to make of none effect the truth of God. How? By causing bitterness and dissension among the Lord's people. Ever meet anybody who seems bent on causing bitterness and dissension among the Lord's people? I have. So do you think Paul's warning here in Romans 16:17 is relevant to us today? You bet it is, because there are those who just seem to thrive on controversy. No matter how many things are settled, they got another reason why the church is off track. And man, if you don't get on board with that, you're doomed. You're doomed. They stir up division and conflict. There are others who seem to tire of the plain, simple truths of the gospel, always looking for some new doctrinal discussion, some new special thing, a new conspiracy, a new whatever, that I've got this and I got this, and most people don't know this, but if you learn this, you're on track and you'll be okay. Some fine line of debate to become involved in, and they seem to take great delight in heating up the battle by getting as many others caught up in the argument as possible. And have been, over the last few decades, a number of groups and organizations and ministries who are to a varying degrees disconnected from the church, and yet they seem compelled to constantly work to stir up division and controversy within the membership of the church. And you know what that work is often called? Reform. Reform. Reform is used pretty broadly, I find. Reform. I'm here to reform the church. In 1992, our church, specifically the North American division of our church, produced this little book called Issues, the Seventh-day Adventist Church and Certain Private Ministries. That's almost a quarter of a century ago. Interesting, the church, it'd be nice to print books about relationship with Jesus. Why would a church print a book like this? It'd be nice if we didn't have to deal with threats to unity. But I guess if the threat was there in Paul's day, we shouldn't be surprised to have to face it in our day. And I think the reason a book like this, and this book is still debated, man. I mean, you go online, some of the groups mentioned in this book, they still reference this thing all the time and have books against it, and it's still talked about. But I think our church leaders prepared this in the spirit of the counsel of Paul in Romans 16:17 to watch and avoid. And there's some official statements in there about a document was included in this about what the reasons were for having to come out as a church and say, hey, there are some movements among us or loosely connected with us that seem to just constantly cause division and hardship, and that's not what we should be about. And I'm not going to take time to go through some of that right now because I am running out of time, or you're probably thinking he's ran out of time. But church members, it's a call to watch and avoid, to be aware of those that would undermine our unity and avoid getting tangled up in it. You know what? Over the years as a pastor, and I don't know, I kept this one. It was one of the early ones, and I used to keep them all, and then I said, why am I keeping these things? But over the years as pastors, you get letters to the church or to you as a pastor, and the letters are to point out to you that the church is corrupt, and the leadership is definitely corrupt, and the best thing to do is to somehow pull out. And I kept this one. This is from way back in 1996. And what happens now is you're not so likely to get a letter, you're likely to get an email, right, which is much easier. And sometimes it's from some, code name or something. You don't really know who sent it. And what used to happen is, what used to happen? Do you remember this in the church? Be in the church parking lot? Someone would be like, hey, come over here. I've got this videotape for your VCR. Some of you don't know what a VCR is. There was these plastic things with these round, and it went from one side to the other. You can look it up on Wikipedia, but they're like, I got this videotape. It's got some really important stuff going on. You don't know what's going on in the church. You should watch this, but don't tell anybody you got it. Don't let the pastor see it. And we get passed around. I got a cassette tape. You should listen to this. Ooh. And that was happening a lot. Everybody's like, oh, I've got this thing to look at. And you know what? It caused a lot of harm, a lot of hurt, a lot of confusion in the church. Was it helpful? You get a letter like this from a retired pastor in Nebraska, retired pastor and evangelist, he claims to be. I assume he sends letters like this to all over North America. And the letter basically talks about genuine Seventh-day Adventists. And basically, it's 3 pages that lists 22 reasons that are supposed to show that most church members and certainly most church leaders are no longer genuine Seventh-day Adventists. Now, I don't know what people expect. You know, people have done that at this church. They come to the front door and they post something on the door. Church is corrupt. The church is serving Satan. Get away from this place. And I don't know what they think. Should I put that on the bulletin board or... But according to this definition, I'm certainly not a genuine Seventh-day Adventist. 3 pages griping about and tearing down the church and its leadership. The only positive thing I found in this letter was there's no page 4. And what happens is it seems to almost always follow this course. It goes to these are all the problems, and then it's like we can't give our support to the church anymore, and we certainly don't give our tithe money to the church because you can't trust it, and pretty soon it's you can't trust any of the leaders, and you really it's dangerous to even meet with them, and in the end it's saying you better meet in your own homes, you better meet in your own little Sabbath schools, and so you're not affected by the influence of the church and its leaders. And, you know, I hope that people who send this stuff out are sincere, and they're obviously committed. Back in this day, it's not email, you know, click 1,000 people you send it to. You got to mail this stuff. You got to get donors. You got to put stamps on. You got to type out addresses. The problem is sometimes it seems these groups are more focused not on sharing Christ with others, but on bringing division to the group that they have left. And, you know, I found it amusing, maybe in a warped way, but the last point 22 on page 3, is an interesting typographical error. I'm pretty sure he meant to say genuine Adventists are a gentle people. But what it actually says is genuine Adventists are a Gentile people. And I found that interesting. I thought, well, maybe that's good. Since I'm not a genuine Adventist, at least I'm not a Gentile, according to this. Watch and avoid. Is the church perfect? No. We live on planet Earth. Christ hasn't come back yet. I expect the church to be perfect. I'm setting myself up for disappointment. Is there a need for reform in the church? Yeah, I think there always will be until Christ comes back. But in God's way. And let me close with this statement from the book Testimonies to Ministers, page 22 and 23. Which I think is a pretty strong statement. It says, when men arise claiming to have a message from God, but instead of warring against principalities and powers and the rulers of the darkness of this world, they form a hollow square and turn the weapons of warfare against the church militant, be afraid of them. They do not bear the divine credentials. God has not given them any such burden of labor. I've met some people that are very burdened. But is it a burden from God? They would tear down that which God would restore by the Laodicean message. He wounds only that he may heal, not cause to perish. The Lord lays upon no man a message that will discourage and dishearten the church. And that's what we got to ask ourselves at some point. If the feeling you get is constant discouragement and disheartening, is that from God? She says, he reproves, that's God. He reproves, he rebukes, he chastens, but it is only that he may restore and approve at last. That's the good news. You know what? God, more than anybody, wants to work reform among us as his people. Don't you think? But God does it his way. And when he brings reform among us, it pulls us together and it draws us closer to him. It doesn't shatter us and rip us apart. That's not the work of God. God restores and he brings unity as a part of the restoration. So Paul's warning is relevant to us today. We need to take initiative to keep our eyes open for those who are producing only division and harm, and as best we can avoid them so that we don't get bogged down in the useless and trivial controversy of endless speculation and argument. We need to watch and avoid. When we do that, we are best positioned to be able to keep our focus where it should be, to be able to go about the business of extending Christ's kingdom so that we can be ready to meet him when he comes back and let other people know that they have an opportunity to be ready to meet him when he comes back. That's what we should spend most of our time on. And that means that sometimes we need, or always, I guess, we need to watch and avoid where necessary. Our closing hymn, let's just sing the first and last verses, but it talks about the center, the solid foundation of our church, and that is Jesus.